Greetings, friends. Benjamin Fulford, LATEST News. Before we proceed with our report, we have updated information for the past week. A former U.S. Marine Corps Special Forces officer and Apache warrior named William Feather received information about reported child torture facilities. These criminals were eliminated at the joint initiative of tribal police officers and deputy village police officers in cooperation with local police officers in California. They took no prisoners. When such a structure goes up in the air, all the people in it die, except, of course, the children. Who can be saved? You can be the girlfriend of one of the men hired to commit this crime, or the cleaner who cleans the toilet. It doesn't matter. You have been shot as a willing accomplice to a capital crime. That's exactly what happened in California. The native tribal police found out about this and took action. We are also told that the people behind these crimes do not belong to the military, but to defense contractors who work from New York, but are operated from Annapolis, Maryland, and use military ranks for their personnel. The hunt for these criminals will continue until the last of them also disappears from this land. Okay, here's this week's report. There is no longer any doubt that regime change is taking place in the Western world. Signs of this include the departure of King Charles, the removal of the Secretary of Defense and Putin's big interview, the peasant uprising across Europe and its spread to countries such as Canada and India are additional signs of this. We also receive initial reports from Polish intelligence that many leaders of the Khazar group, including Victoria Nuland, were eliminated by rocket fire after fleeing to Ukraine last week. Let's start with the news that King Charles has cancer. We learn from sources in the royal family that he was no longer alive at the time of the inauguration. It was magically arranged 6 months, -1 week and 6 days after the removal of Queen Elizabeth in order to turn the British public against him. An official announcement of his death is expected soon. That's what the sources say. Princess would later become the de facto British monarch, acting as regent for Prince William's 10-year-old son George, and is a good person who has been working with white hats for quite some time. Now let's look at the controlled demolition of the Biden presidency. Special prosecutor Robert Hur refused to prosecute the president, in part because he was an elderly man with a poor memory. In other words, Hur said Biden is mentally unfit to stand trial. This puts the so-called leader of the Western world among the most unintelligent and mentally unstable people in the entire US prison system. It might even be true, considering all his gaffes. Just last week, he said he had spoken with the dead French President François Mitterrand and the dead German Chancellor Helmut Kohl. He also called Egyptian President Sisi the President of Mexico. Stephen Miller, a former White House advisor, says, "This is a very low bar to be considered mentally healthy for a trial. This is a very low bar the President of the United States does not meet." He went live on television tonight and talked about closing the humanitarian gate from Mexico to the Gaza Strip. Open.next, you see a very confused Joe, who is absolutely screaming, telling a recycled hocus pocus, and barking all the time, since the real Joe was executed in 2021. This indicates a drop in the number of actors called upon to play his roles. Either that, or the actors are being told to act senile in order to intentionally undermine the credibility of everything. Anyway, this is clearly the end of the show. And now let's look at Tucker Carlson's interview with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The interview has been viewed over 150 million times on Channel X, formerly known as Twitter. X belongs to Elon Musk, who, according to the FSB of Russia, works for the National Intelligence Agency of the US Armed Forces. According to our senior CIA sources, Donald Trump was also in Russia during the interview. There is no doubt that Putin's interview was meant to undermine years of intense anti-Russian propaganda in the West. This means that the US military and Russia have agreed to form an alliance. Now the Russian news agency TASS reports that several dozen news agencies around the world want to interview Putin, making it clear that the campaign to demonize Russia is coming to an end. However, the story of the elephant in the room, which no one is allowed to talk about, definitely applies to this interview. Putin and Tucker avoid talking about Khazaria and the Khazar group, against whom they are now effectively united. However, there were many hints. Putin said that the Bolsheviks had founded a Soviet Ukraine that had never existed before, and for some inexplicable reason Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, insisted that they had the right to leave the USSR. He also said, for unknown reasons, the the Bolsheviks were concerned about Ukrainization, since Putin began his interview by mentioning that Tsars to destroy the Khazar Empire and turned Russia into a Christian state. It becomes clear that he deliberately danced around the Khazars. However, he said that the current rulers of Ukraine idolize the people who exterminated Poles, Jews and Russians. If we are generous, we can assume that he did not want to give the Khazars a reason to accuse him of anti-Semitism. However, there is no doubt that Putin's people have left enough evidence to understand that Russia is fighting a centuries-old conspiracy to create a larger Khazaria. Another important point is that Putin confirms that he has reached an agreement with George H.W. Bush on the joint development of missile technology, the only possible target of which would be China. Putin says that this plan was sabotaged by the Khazar rulers in the United States, who wanted to turn the USSR into several quasi-state entities and subordinate them to divided formations in order to use their combined potential for a future struggle with China. During the interview, Putin handed Carlson a folder with documents. This is the only way to share secrets, because everything digital is compromised. Our own FSB sources confirm that the true purpose of the Russian war in Ukraine is to defeat the Federal Reserve Board and its Khazar owners, such as the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds. In addition, as mentioned above, Polish intelligence reports that as a result of last week's rocket attack, high-ranking German military generals and other officials were removed. Since Victoria Nuland, the real president of Ukraine, was there at the time, we can assume that she was destroyed during a joint operation by the American and Russian military in white hats. Time will show. To understand what the US military really thinks about the Ukrainian government, listen to what the five-star general regarding this newsletter Douglas McGregor says. The president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, is a former actor who played transvestites, was recruited by an oligarch named Kolomoisky, who finances a neo-Nazi battalion and received the blessing of Victoria Nuland. One of Donald Trump's first actions when he took office was to fire Nuland. I hope she's in hell now, where she belongs. Trump has also publicly opposed to Israeli Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Leading figures from around the world, including the Turkish president and the head of the United Nations, accuse him of Nazi-style war crimes. Saudi Arabia, Egypt and all the countries of the Middle East are taking measures against Netanyahu's actions. The world finally wakes up and realizes that Israel was created by the Nazis. Argentine President Javier Milei has appeared in Israel to show the world who his real masters are, the Khazar group. He may have fled to Israel in search of asylum after Argentine Christians found out that he was a Khazar servant. In any case, Trump is the leader of the campaign. Take a look at the huge crowd waiting for President Trump to arrive at a rally in Conway, South Carolina, shouting USA. This is over the limit for Donald Trump to Nikki Haley's home state. Nikki burned down. A Pentagon source comments, Nikki may have started her career in South Carolina, but now she's 100% the candidate of Wall Street and the war machine. President Trump told the crowd in Conway, South Carolina. Trump has made it very clear that he believes Barack Hussein Obama is the real force behind Biden, and promises to put an end to them. This will almost certainly happen before November, but the domino is definitely falling. Senator Mitch McConnell has announced his resignation. Now Congressman Mike Gallagher, who was among the Republicans who voted against the impeachment of Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, has also been asked to resign. As mentioned above, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has returned to the hospital. Meanwhile, in Hungary, President Katalin Novak resigned under the impression of public outrage over the pardon of a man convicted of complicity in a child abuse case. In Canada, Trader Justin Trudeau says the leader of the opposition is proposing to make Canada great again. This is not what Canadians want. There will be a reckoning in England too. Chris Stevens, a survivor of the elite Aldenham School, has publicly blamed British members of the royal family. We also learned from the British intelligence services that they have gone on the warpath against a high-ranking agent, Simon Keyes, who heads the British Civil Service. They confirm that Keyes was involved in a 2012 plot to blow up the Olympic Games and eliminate the entire royal family. Keyes also negotiated a €10 million bribe to Prime Minister Boris Johnson to sell himself as part of a trade and cooperation agreement with the EU. This money is in his offshore account at Henry Ansbacher & Co., a branch of Road Town in the British Virgin Islands in the city of Tortola. To make matters worse, Boss B.J. Keyes knew about Queen Elizabeth's bone cancer and was therefore involved in a second, this time, Unfortunately, successful assassination attempt. He knew that the Queen was dying, but hid this fact from high-ranking members of the royal family, including Princes Andrew and William, thereby preventing them from arriving at Balmoral on time. He set the wrong time for the Queen's death, leaving then Prime Minister Liz Truss in the dark. As soon as the case is eliminated, and it will be eliminated, the entire slave-owning regime of Rishi Sunak will collapse. By the way, a sign of how angry these people are. They are trying to add fluorimide to all drinking water. Meanwhile, Matrix controllers are stealing taxpayers' money to flood Europe and North America with illegal immigrants. If you look at the GDP data for the fourth quarter, you will see that we have received only $300 billion in additional GDP for, at the moment, $834 billion in new federal debt. Most of this $300 billion in GDP growth turns out to be spent by illegal immigrants receiving taxpayer money. When GDP grows at the expense of government spending, it does not measure wealth, but at best the waste of wealth, at worst the destruction of wealth, says Peter Street. In the United States, illegal immigrants receive more money for food stamps than troubled Americans, and will soon receive more than veterans. In Europe, you get air travel, quality hotels, delicious dinners in restaurants, new smartphones, pocket money, free medical care and many other subsidies. When representatives of the sheriffs and police chiefs of the United States went to Washington to discuss this with President Biden, he refused to meet with them to discuss border issues or crime arising from the border issue. The leaders of the Khazar group of the West are also afraid to face angry farmers. While the West and the EU continue to advocate war, and do not care about the carbon footprint of tanks and bombs, they attack farmers because their cows are mooing, comments a source in Polish intelligence. Across Poland, farmers in 260 cities are protesting in front of the Marias because they have nowhere to sell their products. Warehouses are full of Ukrainian grain, and there are even more of them. They oppose the Green Deal and limiting carbon emissions in agricultural production. Farmers are starting to win. According to eyewitnesses, shelves in Belgium are slowly being empty after several days of heavy blockade by farmers of the main warehouses in Aldi and Delis. Farmers are protesting not only across Europe, including England, but also in Canada and India. Fishermen and truck drivers are also joining the protests. Russian President Putin, on the other hand, showed what real leaders should think about when he explained to Carson that humanity is currently facing many threats. Thanks to genetic research, it is not possible to create a Superman, a specialized human being, a genetically modified athlete, scientist, or military man. Whether it's artificial intelligence, genetics, or other fields, the time will come to conclude an international agreement to resolve these issues. This will become possible after the Khazar group is removed from power. Returning to the Khazars, we noticed that the grandiose show to raise money for the Super Bowl had just come to an end. People need to wake up and realize that the NFL is registered as a show business, not a sport. If you want to know who will win or lose, all you have to do is see how the bets are going. Who most people bet on will lose. This is what happens when games are manipulated. So, finally, the Chinese New Year has arrived, and Singapore celebrated it with a flying kite created from 1,500 drones. This is a public display of only one of the many types of Blu-ray design technology